The first toast at Willowbrook Manor in 1852 never reached its glass. Someone had already decided the wedding feast would end in death. This is not a ghost story. It is a ledger of power and fear written in candlelight, and the only person who knew the truth was an enslaved cook named Hannah. Stay with me, and you will learn why the Whitcombs never spoke of that night again. If you want more careful dark history work told without sensationalism, please like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. On a sweltering low-country evening, candles lined the long dining table, silver shivered beneath linen, and guests arrived by carriage and by flatboat to seal a union the planter families had been engineering for years. They came hungry for roasted quail and sugared cakes, for music and wine, and for the promise that their way of life would stretch on without interruption. Folklore says the river kept its own counsel that night, and the house remembered everything. They called the cook Hannah. Others called her Girl, or worse, but the ledger from that summer names her Hannah, an enslaved woman of about 30, fluent in hearth and hunger. From the stone kitchen at the edge of the live oak grove, she commanded fire and spice, knew which cakes rose slow and which jellies set fast. To the wedding party she was a pair of hands. To the children in the yard she was the scent of cinnamon in winter and peach in July. That afternoon the kitchen roof sang with cicadas as she turned batter in a wide ceramic bowl, the paddle tapping the rim like a heartbeat. The master of Willowbrook, Charles Whitcomb in the courthouse books, a man with a voice like a door closing, moved through the house with the certainty of a king. His daughter Rosamond would wear silk the color of poured cream. Her groom Thomas Avery of Bluff Point promised barrels of rice, cedar chests, and sons. The Whitcomb name would twine into the Avery name, and nothing would ever threaten that union. That is what the front parlor believed. The back halls whispered something else, that the house had a past it kept behind its teeth, that Hannah's child, a boy with willow switch legs, had been buried the previous winter after a fever made worse by punishment, and nobody spoke of it above a whisper, that something in the kitchen had cracked without a sound. As storm clouds crouched low, Hannah measured sugar with a wooden scoop worn smooth by years and scraped lemon zest into bright curls. She paused once, fingers steady, eyes on the doorway where thin light cut across the floor, then resumed as if no thought had passed at all. In the dining hall, magnolia blooms browned at the edges, their sweetness turning faintly sour. The best servants moved invisible and close. A piano in the drawing room tried to stay jaunty. The house did not relax. The rumor that would become legend says there was a bowl, a pitcher, a cake, a glaze, each sweet, each simple, each a vessel for celebration. The rumor says something tasted of almonds that night, faint and hateful beneath the sugar. Others would deny it, speak only of a chalky dryness at the back of the tongue, a tightness like fear in the chest. In the moment, no one spoke. Glass chimed. A prayer was said. The feast began. Seconds later, a murmur slid along the table like wind, and the room dimmed even though the candles still burned. What nobody knew was how quickly laughter could curdle. Before the string quartet finished its first reel, a guest gripped the table and blinked into a sudden fog. Another pressed fingers to her stomach as if to knot the pain. A third reached for water and found it sour. Outside, the first drop of rain struck the flagstones. Inside, fear uncoiled around Willowbrook, soft at first, then titanic. The truth was darker than a ruined supper. The truth would follow them down the years. By the time the second course arrived, everyone understood something was wrong, and the nightmare was only beginning. Before the horror took root, Willowbrook was a well-oiled machine of appearances. Whitewashed pillars smiled at the road. The sugar house hid its stench behind hedges. The kitchen carried its own weather under a roof, blackened by years of smoke. Dawn to dusk, the estate performed its rituals, the mistress instructing the parlor maids, the overseer with his ledger of punishments and pounds of rice, the younger Whitcomb boys scratching initials into the bark of trees, as if trees belonged to anyone. In the middle of it moved Hannah, apron stiff with flour, hair wrapped neat against the day's sweat, hands memorizing the family's tastes. She knew how rosy the duck should be for the master, how weak the tea should be for the aunt, who would whisper that Hannah's spice cakes were sinful. She knew the clockwork of the house, because she was expected to keep it running. She also knew what it meant to love and to lose, an infant's grave in a corner of the slave cemetery where the ground sank after rain. The fever had taken the child, or so the doctor said, though those who lived in the quarters would never forget the treatment that came before the sickness, the week of extra tasks done on trembling legs, the cold that seeped into the baby's bones because windows were left open by design. In the months after, Hannah's body moved, but something in her gaze was fixed, like a compass ironed into pointing one direction. Behind closed doors, the Whitcombs congratulated themselves on order and discipline. In the kitchen, grief settled like dust on every surface, impossible to sweep completely. The wedding set the pace for the summer. Trays of candied citrus began to appear. Baskets of figs were rushed in from the orchard at the last possible moment. Eggs, dozens upon dozens, warmed on the table before whipping. Hannah's assistant, a girl no older than 14, beat egg whites until her arm shook, and Hannah quietly swapped the bowl to her own hand without a word. The atmosphere hummed at a higher pitch. Even the spiders seemed to pause in their webs when the master entered. In the pantry, among cardamom, nutmeg, and the linen-wrapped loaves of sugar, sat a jar from the apothecary, white and severe, labeled for rats. The overseer bought it after the spring's infestation, proud to say the bait worked quickly. He kept it carelessly near the spices at first, then moved it after a scolding to the highest shelf. Everyone said they knew not to touch. Everyone said they trusted the cook. What the records make plain is that the Whitcombs controlled every inch of the labor that made their luxury. What the records do not show is what rested in the quiet space between a measured scoop and a looked-away glance. In the afternoon light on the wedding day, Hannah boiled syrup to a thread and tested it by letting it fall, silvery and slow, from the spoon. She brushed a glaze over an almond cake, its crumb pale as moonflesh, and watched it shine. The bride drifted through the doorway, lifted a corner of her veil to taste a crumb and laugh at how sweet it was. Hannah nodded, expression unreadable but not unkind. The bride returned to the parlor, leaving behind the rustle of silk and a faint scent of orange blossom. As the sun dipped and the sky became a sheet of pewter, the dining room was dressed for triumph. Magnolias drooped in crystal. The silver was bright as a scream. If anyone noticed the subtle fatigue under Hannah's eyes, they kept it to themselves. If anyone saw the way her shoulders squared as she lifted the cake, they chose not to understand that a body can be a fortress. The house exhaled as the first guests were called to table. From the kitchen, heat rolled like a tide. Hannah touched the rim of the platter once, as if to ground herself, then stepped into the hall. There is a music to kitchens that outsiders seldom hear, the hiss when wine hits a hot pan, the soft click of a knife finding the board in the same place over and over, the growl of coals stirred back to life. That evening the song ran true, but under it beat a counter-rhythm, a tension in every movement, a quiet purpose that made even the smallest gesture feel heavy with meaning. In a corner stood the mortar where spices were bruised to awaken their oils. On a shelf, the blue-glazed bowl reserved for custards. In the pantry, linens folded to exact widths as if exactness alone kept chaos at bay. In that temple of order, one unlabeled scoop could tip the world. Whether anyone intended it to or not would be the question that refused to die. But this was only the beginning, and what happened next would shake Willowbrook to its foundations. The first sign was so small it could be mistaken for nerves. A cousin of the bride, known for fainting at church, went pale as the quail was served and dabbed at her lip with a linen square. A neighbor from Bluff Point took a sip of spiced punch and pulled back as if the taste had betrayed him, whispering to his wife that something in it was wrong. Moments later, an uncle rose too quickly, hand on his stomach, and the chair legs rasped across the floor in a sound far sharper than it should have been. The quartet missed a note. A draft slid down the hall as if a door had opened that nobody remembered closing. Then the symptoms took hold. One guest choked down a mouthful of cake and felt a dryness gather at the throat like old paper. Another pressed a hand to the back of her neck as heat rose fiercely, then fled, leaving her cold and clammy. A third lifted his wine glass with fingers that would not quite obey, the crystal trembling in a tiny private earthquake. The candlesticks seemed to throw longer shadows by the minute. The almond cake, such a simple pleasure, layered by hands that had spent years perfecting the balance between bitter and sweet, left a taste that did not belong. The bride's veil fluttered as a breeze found it, though the windows were latched. A child laughed at something a cousin said, then went quiet as he watched his mother's face go slack with a wave of pain. Plates clicked down. Chairs rasped in halting concert. Someone called for water. Someone else whispered to fetch the doctor. And in that small confusion, in that moment before panic blooms, Hannah stood at the threshold of the dining room, neither moving forward nor stepping back, the kitchen's heat still on her skin, the cool of the hall creeping into her bones. Dr. Emery, summoned from a nearby supper, arrived in a flurry and began the quick litany of questions and remedies known to a man who believed himself the last thin wall before death. He looked at pupils, at tongues, at stomachs clenched into hard knots. He asked what had been served, in what order, with what ingredients. He listened for breath that whistled or rattled. He lifted the lid from the punch bowl and sniffed, then frowned as if smell alone could accuse. Whispers ran around the edges of the room. "Arsenic," someone said too loudly. The word settled like ash. In the kitchen, the fire was beginning to go down, its heart red and sullen. The assistant hovered, hands twisting in her apron, eyes wide. Hannah moved in deliberate lines, rinsing a pot, setting down a cloth, wiping a rim clean that had not needed wiping. She could hear the house like a far-off storm. She could hear the breath of the night insects, the first hard hits of rain on hot stone, the clatter as servants ran for vinegar, for milk, for anything the doctor shouted might help. "The taste of almonds," someone insisted. "But almonds are not poison," came the reply. "Not by themselves. There are things the records cannot tell us." What memory flickered behind Hannah's eyes just then? What vow, what fracture? There are things the house would not dare confess, what it had been built upon, whose bones lay beneath the polished floors, what price the Whitcomb name had extracted from those forced to feed it. But there are things any witness could say, that the candle flames thinned to needles as a wind found the chimneys, that the room felt suddenly smaller, that the river, unseen beyond the trees, seemed to hold its breath. One of the Whitcomb boys, face gray with fright, began to cry without sound. As the doctor barked orders and the overseer stormed into the kitchen, as suspicion sharpened like a blade in a gloved hand, something else entered the room, a certainty that this night would be told and retold, that it would harden into a macabre story carrying the taste of sugar and grief. In that certainty there was terror, and a flicker of truth that could not be named without tearing the world. The hour was late, the moon veiled in cloud, and still the worst had not yet unfolded. By the time the storm broke open over the roof, the house had sealed its doors. What came next would end the pretense forever. If this slow burn reconstruction has you leaning in, tap like and subscribe so more people can find careful source-grounded history instead of sensational rumor. The peak arrived without fanfare. The bride's aunt slid down the wallpaper, the pattern smearing under her damp palm as she sat hard on the floor. A planter from 2 farms over fell across the table, breath sawing, words stranded behind his teeth. The master himself, Charles Whitcomb, tried to lift his daughter's arm and found his own hand unsteady, the strong man's grip gone curiously soft. The music ceased. The room became a held breath. In the corridor beyond, someone vomited into a basin and then groaned as if the sound were pulled out of him by a hook. Dr. Emery, face drawn tight, ordered emetics for some, milk and egg whites for others, cool cloths for all. He ordered everyone to stop eating, to stop drinking, to wait. He asked again what had gone into the cake, into the punch, into the glazes. His eyes moved to the kitchen door as if it were a mouth that had spoken blasphemy. The overseer, sensing his cue, seized Hannah by the wrist, not violently yet, but with ownership, and barked that she would answer. She did not struggle. She did not speak. She looked at him with an expression so calm that he turned away first, as if scorched by it. They searched the pantry and the spice cabinet. They found the apothecary jar on the highest shelf, stoppered, chalk-white ley dust inside, arsenic for rats, purchased legally, labeled correctly, present among the ingredients of celebration, because the realities of the house did not mind colliding. A servant said the overseer had moved it days before. The overseer said he had warned everyone. The doctor said the symptoms matched what the word arsenic conjured: tormented stomachs, trembling limbs, throats that burned as if from invisible fire. No one used the word accident aloud. The room thirsted for guilt the way a dry field thirsts for rain. Hannah was led to the back hall, then to the yard under the dripping eaves. Rain pecked at the hard-packed earth. Thunder crawled across the river. Rosamond, the bride, looked once at the woman who had fed her every winter since she had been old enough to complain about cinnamon and clove, and something in her expression tore. She reached for her father's sleeve. He shook her hand away without looking. He told someone to fetch the sheriff. As lanterns converged and the house moaned in its timbers, the sheriff arrived with the implacable calm of a man who believed order could be restored by merely speaking its name. He asked for statements. He asked to see the kitchen. He asked to hear from the cook. When Hannah opened her mouth, the yard held its breath. She said, in a voice even and low, that she had cooked what she was told to cook. that she had measured what she had always measured, that she had seen the jar moved and heard no warning after. She said nothing about the cemetery. She said nothing about winter. She said nothing about the way a body can keep score when the world refuses to write anything down. The sheriff wrote as if writing could fix a truth in place. Perhaps he heard the almond that some swore lingered in the room. Perhaps he heard the ugly hope in a few hearts that the blame would land neatly, with no ripples beyond the kitchen door. Lightning whitened the yard. Somewhere in the quarters a baby woke and began to cry. The storm spent itself in sheets until only dripping remained. Within the house 2 guests would not wake before sunrise. Justice would come, someone whispered, but at a terrible price. The question was, for whom? In the days that followed, men would invoke science as if it were a talisman. They would send for a traveling chemist with glass vials and a black case, and he would speak of a test that could coax a mirror of arsenic from the faintest trace. The Marsh test, he called it. Though his instruments, jostled by bad roads and rough handling, would not yield the certainty the sheriff craved. They would boil scraps from the punch bowl, scrape a smear from the cake plate, breathe in fumes they did not understand. Beside this display of reason would sit the raw logic of the time, power defending itself, fear needing a face. In that clash, evidence bent. The law in those parts could move with teeth when it wished. Silence, too, had its own machinery. Witnesses changed their minds. Statements lengthened until they said nothing. A minister prayed for order while ignoring the storm that order had always contained. And through it all, the image of Hannah in the yard, rain stippling her dress, gaze level, mouth a quiet line would become the scene people remembered when they could no longer bear to recall the room of groans and the smell of scorched sugar turned vile. By morning the house smelled of vinegar, rain, and grief. Windows stood open to the gray day. Fire lay low in the hearths. Flies touched down and lifted from abandoned plates. 2 bodies rested in the parlor, touched by the careful hands of those who understood how to make the dead presentable. The rest of the party moved like sleepwalkers. The bride sat with a quilt over her knees, face turned to the river as if it could carry her away by looking. The master paced, rehearsing anger like prayer. People spoke of illness, of poison, of curses. Someone whispered that the land itself had objected to the wedding, but most agreed, willingly or not, that a human hand had arranged this macabre turning of joy to ruin. Hannah was taken to the jail at the edge of the district, a 2-room building that tried to be a fortress and managed only to be cold. She sat on a bench, breathing slowly, while the sheriff's clerk scratched her name into a book as if ink were the law itself. In the newspapers that week, some still preserved, others crumbled to lace. Columnists argued with certainty and without knowledge. They wrote that enslaved cooks must be watched, that they held too much power. They invoked old stories and fresh lies. They did not write about the infant's grave. They did not write about the way grief moves when it has nowhere to go. The legal outcome, like so much else in that era, split into versions. One set of records suggests she confessed after days without sleep, her words shaped by the hands of men who needed the world to make sense again. Another suggests no confession exists at all, only a line that says sentence carried out, the rest of the page left blank by design. There were executions for poison in those years. There were sales to farther plantations, a punishment that feigned to be mercy while ripping people from every familiar thing. There were quiet disappearances from records, as if names could be unmade by refusing to write them again. In each version the outcome was the same, a life taken, by rope or by ledger. The Whitcombs buried their dead under oaks that had seen generations come and go. The house resumed its rituals in the brittle way a broken bone can be set to hold again, never the same. The bride wore mourning for a year. The groom returned to Bluff Point. People avoided the almond cake for a long time. In the kitchen, a new cook learned the stove's temperament and pretended there was not an absence like a person in the corner of the room. The storm of that night became a story to frighten children into obedience, and a warning to those who lived their lives in service, proof that the smallest decisions could fill a house with dread. History's ledger is uneven. The voices that might tell us what Hannah carried, what she intended, what she feared, were denied ink and paper. Their sentences were cut short by design. We are left with a house that seemed to inhale and hold its breath, with magnolias browning on the table, with a taste that did not belong in celebration, with a river passing by that did not stop but did remember. We are left with the knowledge that a society built on cruelty will call any disruption evil, and yet cannot see the evil at its center. The macabre truth is not in the poison alone, it is in the conditions that made a kitchen into a crucible. Today, if you stand where Willowbrook once stood, if it still stands at all, you might hear the insects sing just as they did, feel the heat bend the air, smell something sweet turning a little sour. You might think of a woman who could make a cake so fine it melted on the tongue, and a night when everything solid became uncertain. You might think of a legacy of fear that was not born in a single evening, but revealed there in candlelight to those who had refused to see it. And you might understand, finally, that the price of forgetting is always paid by those the records refuse to name. What remains is a caution carried like a secret, that a society which sows domination will reap dread, that a sweetness forced upon suffering will curdle into something bitter and unforgettable. The river moves on, but memory lingers in the damp heat, in the hush before thunder, in the way magnolia petals bruise. The macabre story of Willowbrook does not ask for judgment as much as witness, and in bearing witness, we refuse the comfort of not knowing. The inquest convened in a room that smelled of oilcloth and damp books, the kind of place where certainty is supposed to be manufactured from fragments. The coroner, a man used to farm accidents and the occasional fever death, arranged his papers as if arrangement itself could deliver clarity. He asked about the punch bowl, about the cake, about a glaze that shone like lacquer. He asked who tasted what and when their faces changed. He asked about almonds, and some nodded and some shook their heads, and more than one person said they had never eaten an almond and could not say. On the table sat the traveling chemist's case, its glassware clinking softly with every footfall. He spoke of reagents and precipitates, of a mirror that might appear if arsenic were teased from a stain, the Marsh test, imported knowledge balancing in delicate tubes. The audience held its breath as he heated, cooled, combined, waited. The room offered only silence, and the metallic scent of expectation. Then a flicker of something on the glass. Was it the telltale sheen, or soot betrayed by an unsteady flame? He would not swear to it. In the record that survives, a clerk wrote, "Demonstration inconclusive, further samples required. The law prefers binaries. Life rarely obliges. The ledger from the plantation storehouse recorded rat poison purchased the previous spring, common as nails in such places, a tool in the war against vermin that fed on stores. It recorded a lemon cream of tartar for baking. It recorded lemons brought up river on a flatboat, sugar in sacks soft with humidity, flour by the barrel. The line that could have solved the case was not there. Nothing about who held the key on the day someone reached for the jar. Testimony from the kitchen arrived in careful sentences, each one weighed for cost. A scullery girl, not yet 12, said she saw a jar taken down and set back not quite where it belonged. A boy who worked a yard said he carried buckets from the well and heard laughter from the dining room that sounded wrong, pitched high and tight. The butler, trained to be invisible, admitted he saw the master leave the table and return with his jaw set, said he could not read a face that had been made for unreadability. Every word risked a future. Every silence risked more. Someone asked about Hannah's temper, because such questions are always asked about women who refuse to be swallowed by their circumstances. A cousin said she had none. An aunt said everyone has one. A field hand said nothing, though the tendons in his neck stood out as if holding back a sentence. No one asked the house itself what it remembered. The slammed doors, the late-night footsteps to the sugar house, the way a mother's breath can turn to iron when a child's name is no longer spoken aloud. In the kitchen ledger, there were recipes written in a rounded hand. Pound cake, butter beaten until it sighs, lemon custard, do not let it weep, syllabub, whisk with patience. Beside them, later, a different hand added notations. More sugar for the master, less clove for the aunt. In the margin of the cake recipe, a faint pencil line, no bitter almonds. The note could have been about taste. It could have been about safety. It could have been a warning written after the fact and made to look like it had always been there. Ink is not the only thing that can be forged, so can memory. A jar marked with a skull and bones would have been a luxury of clarity. Most poisons in that place moved in plain containers, powders for pests, tonics for women, patent cures that soothed until they didn't. In the Low Country, almonds meant extravagance. The idea that their scent might travel through rumor to become a diagnosis tells us as much about fear as about chemistry. What the Marsh test could not prove unequivocally, reputation rushed to fill. Power closed ranks in the days after the funeral. Planters visited each other in rooms where shutters stayed half closed against heat and prying eyes. Words like tragedy and justice were used to justify arrangements that looked in practice like self-preservation. If Hannah confessed, the story would be simple: evil contained, punished, forgotten by those allowed to forget. If she refused, other tools would be used: sale, removal, disappearance from the ledger that counted people the way it counted barrels of rice. One notice in a coastal paper from the next season mentions a woman of fine kitchen skills sold to an estate farther south. The name is not given. Another mentions an execution in a neighboring parish for poison. The dates press close without touching. History keeps them that way when it suits it. Among those who had eaten and survived, conversation took on a strained brightness, the way people whistle near graveyards. The bride left the house for a time. The groom retreated to affairs of business. Servants were reshuffled, as if rearranging labor could erase what labor already knew. The quarters learned again the lesson it had always held, that safety is not a place but a practice of watchfulness and care for one another when the law looks past you. Decades later, when war had come and gone, and the legal shape of the South changed on paper if not in every field, an old man told a Works Progress Administration interviewer about a wedding where the cake made folks heavy, like they was sinking down while standing up. He spoke of a cook he remembered as straight-back, quiet. He said he never tasted almond in his life and did not need to know something was wrong. In another county, a woman sang a bit of a rhyme children were told: "Don't eat rich cake at rich folks' table. The sweetness got a tail on it." Between those lines, live histories that official ledgers refuse to carry. An 1889 letter from a cousin to a cousin mentions Willowbrook going to seed. The roof was failing. The sugar house stood empty. The kitchen hearth, black and patient, waited for hands that would not return. A state survey in 1907 marked the property in decline. By the mid-20th century, the live oaks shaded a house without windows, the river crawling on as it always had, indifferent and constant. Tourists came for the azaleas in spring and did not know where to point their cameras when told this was the place. In the 1970s, a local historical society tried to restore what could be restored. They found shards of ceramic in the kitchen yard, a teaspoon bent at the neck, glass like frozen tears in the ash near the hearth. Soil cores near the well revealed traces of metals common to the period. Nothing criminal can be read from that, though some tried. A conservator looked at the ledger and showed where later ink lay like a film over earlier words. A descendant of the house's enslaved community stood in the doorway and refused to enter, saying some rooms have learned to hold their breath too long. On public tours, docents learned to tell the story carefully, to name Hannah without adding words no record could support, to say what is known and what is guessed, and to leave space for what was denied a witness. Some visitors wanted a neat villain. Others wanted absolution for their ancestors. The responsible ones walked away quieter, hearing the piano in the drawing room trying to be jaunty and failing, feeling the magnolia's perfume turn faintly sick at the edges. What could justice have looked like in 1852? Not the rope, not the sail, not the silence. It might have looked like a courtroom where Hannah's words were not shaped by the needs of the powerful. It might have looked like a coroner who understood the limits of his tests and the context of his subjects, like a community that saw the violent system it stood upon and refused to call its own fear order. It might have looked like a ledger that did not count human lives among barrels and bricks. In the absence of that impossible justice, there remains a duty to tell the story without spectacle. The macabre lies not in gore but in arrangements: who eats at what table, who cooks, who is named, who is blamed, who is believed. To say Willowbrook was haunted is too easy. The better sentence is that Willowbrook was built to haunt. Every candlestick on that table held not only light, but also the shadow of the world that placed it there. If you go looking for Willowbrook now, you may find only a rise in the land where the house once sat, some bricks sinking back to clay, a fig tree that refuses to stop bearing. The river will still be there. In summer the air will taste the same, heavy with magnolia and salt. If you stand long enough, you may hear a clink of glass that is not there, or the paddle of a whisk tapping the rim of an absent bowl. That is memory, doing what it can without permission. To those who ask for certainty, the ledger answers with gaps. To those who ask for meaning, the house offers a lesson in how fear and power share a table and call it supper. To those who ask what became of Hannah, there are only versions, each with a cost measured in human breath. We choose which version to carry forward by how we speak her name. Across this series, we commit to telling such histories with care, naming systems, not inventing monsters, tracing records and their silences, honoring the people whose lives were reduced to entries and omissions. If careful, source-grounded dark history is what you want more of. Please like the video and subscribe. It truly helps us keep this work going. And if you carry anything from Willowbrook, let it be this: sweetness forced upon suffering will curdle, and houses built on fear always, eventually speak. For those who prefer a timeline to a tale, set it down like this: afternoon, kitchen heat, lemon zest, batter beating, servants moving as precisely as clocks, dusk, candles trimmed, punch mixed, a bowl carried with both hands as if it could spill not only liquid, but the premise of an evening. First course, laughter easy, relief palpable, plans proceeding. Music, a reel, the beau's hair catching on a note that sounds like a question. Glasses, raised, then set down with mouths pursed. Minutes, a handful only, enough to cross from certainty to dread. Murmur, traveling the table faster than the servants can. Doors opening for air that doesn't help. Rain beginning, and then the long collapse of a night into consequence. If that structure feels clinical, remember the human textures it cannot hold. The chalk-dry feeling in a throat. A mother's palm on a young man's back, steadying him as if posture could undo it. A cook, hands still, not because she has nothing more to do but because there is nothing left she can do that will be believed. There is another school of thought among later tellers, that no poison need be invoked at all. They speak of summer spoilage and milk turned wrong, of eggs that hid their age behind sugar, of copper reacting with acidic glaze, of pedomain as a catch-all word used by doctors to name what they did not yet understand. They point out that the almond story arrived later, that the earliest entries in ledgers and letters mention only sickness and fear, and then the naming of a culprit. This version does not acquit anyone. It accuses a system that required a vulnerable person to cook for those who held power over her and then blamed her when the body's mysteries arrived at the worst possible moment. In that reading, the Marsh test's inconclusiveness matters in a different way, not as a failure but as a reminder of the limited tools of the time. It asks modern listeners to avoid cleverness and practice humility. It asks us to see how rumor can become evidence when those in charge find a narrative useful. It asks us to keep two truths side by side, that poison was possible and that scapegoating was probable. Finally, a word about names. The courthouse books give us Charles Whitcomb and Elsewhere's and Avery from Bluff Point. They give us the floors of a house, how many windows faced which direction, how many barrels of rice arrived which month. They give us once the name Hannah. We are asked to build an understanding from that single granted syllable, aware that even it might be the name forced upon her by those who believed they could own her. When we say it here, we say it with uncertainty and respect, refusing to decorate the silence with inventions. We say it to resist the second death that comes when a person is reduced to an anecdote, a cautionary emblem at the edge of someone else's story. If you've stayed this long, you know this is not a ghost story. It is the record of a house arranged to concentrate power and to hide its costs in kitchens and quarters and cemeteries without stones. The wedding at Willowbrook was meant to stitch name to name and secure a future. Instead, it revealed the seam where the fabric was already tearing. We keep looking there, not to savor ruin, but to tell the truth about what the candles showed.